Captain Lucas Carter leaned over the viewport of his ship, the Indomitable, his gaze fixed on the pale blue sphere of Galtor below. It was a peaceful world, once thriving with life, now scared by years of slow decay. The Gerin, a species known for their fragile physiology and peaceful nature, had been caught in the crossfire of galactic politics, and now they were on the brink of extinction. Their once vibrant cities lay in ruins, crumbling under the relentless assault of the Gorgath, a savage, war-hungry species known for their brutal efficiency in warfare. The Gerin had been abandoned by the Krathuri, the only species with enough power to defend them, and their desperate cry for help had been answered by humanity alone. It was a call that rang out across the stars, a final plea to any race who would listen. Yet it had fallen on deaf ears, except for humanity. The Gerin had always been seen as weak by the galactic community, their pacifist nature a burden in the harsh realities of interstellar conflict. No one wanted to risk their own forces for a race that could do little more than beg for mercy. All except one. Humanity, a species that had made a name for itself by surviving against impossible odds, by fighting with fire and cunning where others hesitated. "We're approaching the landing zone, Captain," reported Lieutenant Maria Vega, her voice steady as she worked the console at the helm. She didn't need to look up to know Carter's mood. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. Carter exhaled, turning away from the viewport. Time to meet the locals. The ship descended through the thick atmosphere of Galtor, the clouds parting to reveal the desolation below. As the ground came into view, the devastation was impossible to ignore. The Gerin capital, once a gleaming city of glass and spires, was little more than smoldering ruins now. Whole sections of the planet's surface had been scorched by the Gorgath's orbital bombardments. The human fleet had arrived just in time, but the planet's future was uncertain. The Gerin, fragile and vulnerable, were barely holding on. Most of their population had retreated into underground shelters, far from the deadly airstrikes that continued to rain down from above. As Carter's shuttle touched down on the tarmac of what had once been a grand palace, he could see the thin, tall figures of the Gerin waiting in the distance. Their skin, a muted shade of green, seemed almost translucent under the harsh sunlight. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear and hope, a mixture that was both haunting and compelling. A tall Gerin leader stepped forward, his fragile frame trembling under the weight of the planet's despair. "Captain Carter," he began, his voice high and strained, "you are our last hope. The Gorgath show no mercy. We cannot hold them off any longer." Carter straightened, stepping off the shuttle and walking toward the leader. His gaze locked with the Gerins, and in that moment, he made a silent vow. No one else would die on this planet if he had a say in it. "We'll fight for you," he said, voice firm. "But we need to know one thing. Are you willing to fight for yourselves?" The Gerin leader, Talarin, hesitated, his translucent green skin catching the fading light as he looked up at Captain Carter. His large, black eyes, usually full of quiet wisdom, were now clouded with doubt. He glanced back at the group of his fellow Gerin, many of whom stood behind him, heads bowed. The weight of their situation was unbearable. "I don't know," Talarin admitted, his voice wavering. "Our people are not warriors. We have never known war. How can we fight a race like the Gorgath?" His words echoed the fear that had spread through the entire planet. "We were always content to live in peace. Now we are facing annihilation." Carter's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of his own decision pressing down on him. He wasn't just representing humanity's resolve now. He was holding the future of an entire species in his hands. "I understand," Carter replied, his tone calm yet firm. "But you're not alone anymore. We'll help you defend your planet, but you need to understand something. We can't win this war for you. You have to fight. Your survival depends on it." The silence stretched between them, thick with uncertainty. The other Gerin leaders whispered among themselves in their native language, their voices low and hesitant. Carter knew they had no choice but to accept his words. If they didn't take up arms now, Their race would be erased from existence. The Gorgath had no mercy. Talaran looked back at Carter, his expression resolute despite the fear still clouding his features. What must we do? Carter didn't waste a moment. We begin training immediately. We'll show you how to fight, how to use your environment against them, and how to survive in this new world. The Gorgath won't come with honor. They'll come with numbers, weapons, and brute force, but they won't expect you to fight back. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. That's where we have the advantage. You're not bound by the same rules they are. You fight like humans do, with cunning, unpredictability, and determination. For the first time, Carter saw a flicker of something in the Joran's eyes. Resolve. It was small, but it was there. Talaran straightened his back, his hands trembling, but no longer from fear. We will learn, he said. We will fight. Carter nodded. Good. The first step is learning how to defend yourselves. I'm not going to lie to you. This will be hard. But if you want to live, this is the only path forward. Over the next few days, Carter worked with the Joran leaders and their warriors, teaching them basic tactics. The Joran weren't naturally built for combat. Most were too thin, too frail, but their keen intelligence and ability to learn quickly became their greatest asset. They learned fast. Carter pushed them, forced them to adapt. They spent hours training with mock weapons, practicing stealth movements, and learning how to set traps using the planet's dense forests and rocky terrain to their advantage. At the same time, humanity's advanced technology helped bolster the Joran defenses, from energy shields to basic but effective weaponry. But even with all their training, Carter knew the Joran would need something more. They would need something to ignite the fire of true resistance in their hearts, and that spark would have to come from within. Are you ready to show the Gorgath what we're made of? Carter asked as they finished their training for the day. Talaran looked back at him, his expression hardening. Yes, we are ready. The captain smiled. Then it's time to fight. The sun was setting over Galtor as Captain Carter stood atop the high walls of the Joran stronghold, overlooking what was left of their capital. The ground beneath was charred and cracked, the remnants of Gorgath bombardments still smoking in the distance. But despite the destruction, the air was thick with a sense of determination. The Joran were no longer the passive, fearful species they had been when Carter first arrived. They were warriors now, forged in the fires of necessity. Carter's mind raced with plans and strategies. The Gorgath fleet was on its way, and they had to act quickly. Their first strike had to be swift, brutal, and unpredictable, just like humanity's tactics. No one knew what to expect from the humans, and that was their greatest strength. Carter's team of elite soldiers, along with a newly formed squad of Joran fighters, was ready for the test. Captain, Lieutenant Maria Vega's voice crackled over the comm. The Gorgath are making their final approach. We've intercepted their communications. They're expecting a quick sweep of the planet's defenses. They won't expect a full assault from the surface. Carter smiled grimly. That's exactly what they'll get. He turned to Talaran and the other Joran leaders who had gathered at the planning table in the war room. The map displayed on the screen was a layout of their last remaining defenses, now reinforced with human technology. You've trained hard, Carter said, scanning each of their faces. Now we put everything we've learned to the test. This isn't about fighting like the Gorgath. It's about fighting smarter. We use the terrain, the forests, the caves. We draw them in, and then we hit them where it hurts. Talaran nodded, a fire in his eyes. We understand. We will not let them destroy our world. The plan was simple. The Gorgath, used to their overwhelming power, would expect to see the Joran cowering behind barricades or retreating into their underground shelters. What they wouldn't expect was a full-on offensive, one that targeted their supply lines and key infrastructure. Under cover of night, Carter's team and the Joran fighters moved out in stealth, each group carrying a payload of explosives. They struck first at the Gorgath's fuel depot, the heart of their orbital bombardment capability. The blast shook the ground, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the sky. First target hit, Vega reported, her voice calm despite the chaos. It'll take them hours to mobilize their backup supply lines. Good, keep them busy, Carter responded. Move on to the next position. The humans and Jaren moved in perfect coordination, their tactics synchronized as if they had been fighting together for years. Their next strike was against a Gorgoth command center, hidden deep within a rocky ridge. Using their newly learned stealth techniques, they infiltrated the structure, planting explosives on the main communication relay, cutting the Gorgoth off from their fleet. The Gorgoth were now blind. As the explosions rocked the night, Carter knew that this was only the beginning. The Gorgoth would retaliate with everything they had, but for now, they had a small but crucial advantage. Get ready, Carter said as they retreated into the shadows. This is just the start. The Gorgoth will come, and when they do, we'll be waiting. The first strike had been a success, but the real battle was about to begin. The Gorgoth would not take kindly to being undermined, and Carter had no illusions about what was to come. But for the first time since he arrived on Galtor, he saw something in the Jaren. Hope. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back, and with humanity at their side, they might just stand a chance. The Gorgoth retaliated swiftly, as Carter had expected. Within hours of the successful strikes, their forces regrouped, and their war machines descended upon Galtor with a fury that rattled the planet itself. Carter stood before a hastily assembled war council, the faces of Jaren leaders etched with growing concern. The brief moment of hope they'd held on to after the first strike was evaporating quickly. The Gorgoth were unlike any enemy that the Jaren had ever encountered, ruthless, tactical, and seemingly without limits. We've only delayed them, Carter said, his voice low and tense. The Gorgoth won't be satisfied until they've wiped this world clean. We need to fortify our positions and prepare for their assault. The room was heavy with silence as Talrin spoke up. How many more strikes can we survive? Their fleet. It's vast. Not just the fleet, Carter replied, glancing at the holomap of Galtor that flickered above the table. They're deploying ground forces, infantry, heavy artillery, and those damn warships. They'll come for the stronghold first. How do we stop them? Talrin asked, his voice filled with desperation. We don't stop them, Carter said grimly, his eyes narrowing. We slow them down. We make them fight for every inch of this planet. We hit them hard, where it counts. We force them into the jungles, into the mountains, into places where their superior numbers don't mean as much. The Jaren leaders exchanged nervous glances, but there was something in Carter's voice, an edge of confidence, that they hadn't heard from him before. Despite the overwhelming odds, the plan began to take shape. This wasn't a fight for victory. It was a fight for survival. That night, Carter led a small strike team into the heart of a Gorgoth base, hidden within a dense, fire-scorched forest. They moved in total silence, shadows among shadows, as Carter signaled the start of the operation. The Jaren, armed with crude but effective makeshift explosives, and the new weapons Carter had taught them to use, struck at the heart of the Gorgoth's artillery emplacements. The explosion that rocked the base was deafening. The Gorgoth, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. But the humans and Jaren had already melted back into the jungle, leaving nothing but smoke and the scent of burning metal behind them. Carter's voice came over the comms. They're confused, but not for long. We need to move fast and hit as many of their forward positions as we can. If we can keep them off balance, we might just have a shot. Understood, Vega replied, her voice calm and efficient as always. But Carter knew that the real test was yet to come. The Gorgoth would eventually adapt. They would regroup. And when they did, their rage would be unlike anything the Jaren had ever seen. As the team pulled back, Carter looked up at the stars above, wondering how long they could hold out. But one thing was certain. The Gorgoth would no longer underestimate the humans, or the Jaren. This war was far from over, and it would be won not by brute force, but by resilience and cunning. "You've got this," Carter whispered, mostly to himself, as he looked out over the burning horizon. "We've got this." The weeks that followed were a blur of hit-and-run skirmishes, night raids, and desperate gambits. Every victory, no matter how small, was quickly overshadowed by the Gorgath's unrelenting pursuit. The alien invaders were ferocious, their war machines more advanced and more numerous than anything the Jaren had ever seen. But Captain Carter had seen enough to know that their strength came from sheer brutality, not strategy. And that was where humanity, and now the Jaren, had the upper hand. Carter had quickly realized that while the Jaren could never match the Gorgath's firepower, they could exploit the terrain in ways their enemies couldn't. Galtor's jungles and mountains, once seen as a hindrance, became their greatest asset. The Jaren had the advantage of knowing the land intimately, and Carter's guerrilla tactics allowed them to strike from the shadows, always staying one step ahead of the Gorgath. However, Carter knew this could only last so long. They were running out of time. The Gorgath were methodical and relentless, and the longer the conflict dragged on, the more likely the Gorgath would adapt to their tactics. Something more decisive was needed, something that would change the course of the war. Then Carter received an unexpected communication from an old ally. "Carter, it's Commander Ilara of the Vanguard Fleet." The voice crackled through the comms. "We've heard about what's happening on Galtor. We're coming to assist. Expect reinforcements in 3 hours." Carter's heart skipped a beat. The Vanguard Fleet, the most elite force in humanity's arsenal, was on its way. He'd fought alongside them in past campaigns, and they were as fierce as they came. If anyone could help turn the tide, it was them. But their arrival would only give the Jaren a fighting chance if they could hold on long enough. "We've got 3 hours, people," Carter said to his team as they gathered around a holographic map in their command center. "We need to hit the Gorgath with everything we've got before the fleet arrives. I've been in touch with Ilara. She's got a fleet of bombers that can take out their forward command centers if we can keep them occupied. But that means we have to hit them harder than we ever have before. We hit their airfields, their ground units, everything. We'll make them think we're coming from every direction at once." The Jaren leaders, now fully trained and more confident, nodded. They had learned to fight like humans, and now they were willing to take the fight to the Gorgath. Talrin, standing near the front, spoke with newfound resolve. "We will do our part. We will fight." Carter's voice grew stern. "This is it. We take out their fuel depots, their artillery positions, and their troop movements. We make them bleed. When the Vanguard arrives, we hit them with everything we've got." As Carter's team, along with the Jaren, mobilized for the assault, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would define the future of Galtor. The Gorgath were strong, but humanity had something they didn't: courage. It was a raw, unpolished strength, but it was enough to change the course of a war. "Let's make it count," Carter muttered under his breath as he led the charge. The sky above them was dark, but the fires of their rebellion would soon light the way. The Gorgath may have thought they could crush Galtor with their sheer might, but they hadn't accounted for the will of 2 species fighting for their survival. And that, Carter believed, was their greatest weapon. The night before the final assault, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The Jaren warriors, once timid and fragile, were now hardened by weeks of combat training and the brutal realities of war. They moved with purpose, setting explosives and finalizing their strategies. Carter knew that once they started, there would be no turning back. The Gorgath would be relentless, and every victory would come at a steep price. Standing at the front of a temporary command post, Carter looked over the assembled troops, human and Jaren alike. There was no turning back now. He could see the determination in their eyes, but he also saw fear. It was the same fear that had driven humanity to survive and thrive in the most hostile environments imaginable. And it was the same fear that had driven the Jaren to take up arms, knowing they had no other choice. "We've trained for this," Carter said, his voice cutting through the low murmurs of the group. We've survived against the odds, and we fought back when others said we couldn't. Tomorrow, the Gorgath will know they made a mistake coming here. We will make sure they regret it." Toleran stood by Carter's side, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "We have learned much, Captain. But we are still untested. Tomorrow will be the true test of our strength." Carter met his gaze. "It's not just about strength. It's about our will to fight for what's ours. The Gorgath won't stop unless we make them. Tomorrow, we make them wish they'd never come to Galtor." The plan was simple but dangerous. They would hit the Gorgath's critical infrastructure, targeting their airfields, fuel depots, and artillery positions. The Jeren would act as the vanguard, drawing the Gorgath into the trap, while Carter's human forces and the Vanguard fleet would provide air support and strike from above. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Carter gave the signal to move out. The Jeren, now clad in makeshift armor and armed with weapons they'd never imagined wielding, set off with determined steps. They had come a long way from the pacifists that had first begged for aid. Now, they were warriors, each one carrying the weight of their people's survival on their shoulders. Carter, leading his team of elite soldiers, moved in tandem with the Jeren forces. The operation began as planned. Swift, silent strikes at the Gorgath's supply lines and key positions. The ground shook as the first wave of explosions tore through the enemy's defenses. Carter could hear the distant hum of the Vanguard's bombers as they launched their assault from the skies, obliterating the Gorgath's forward command posts. The Gorgath, caught off guard by the ferocity and coordination of the attack, scrambled to regroup. But it was too late. The Jeren fought with a ferocity Carter hadn't seen before, their survival instincts kicking in as they laid waste to the Gorgath's ranks. But the fight was far from over. Carter's comms crackled to life as Vega's voice rang through. "Captain, the Gorgath are pushing back. They've called in reinforcements from their main fleet. We got a few minutes before they overwhelm us." "Hold the line," Carter ordered, his grip tightening on his weapon. "We've come too far to back down now." As the battle raged on, the Jeren showed a resilience that even Carter hadn't fully anticipated. They fought with everything they had, using the terrain to their advantage, laying ambushes and setting traps. The Gorgath, for the first time, were the ones caught off guard. It was a battle of endurance, of attrition. But Carter knew this was the moment they had to seize. The Gorgath's main force was closing in, and soon the advantage would slip away. He looked up at the sky, waiting for the moment when the full might of the Vanguard fleet would turn the tide in their favor. "We hold them here," Carter muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on his rifle. "This is our last chance." The battle intensified as the Gorgath reinforcements arrived in full force. Their warships descended from the sky, massive and terrifying, casting long shadows over the terrain below. On the ground, their infantry pushed forward, armored soldiers swarming over the landscape, their weapons firing in rapid succession. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Explosions rocked the earth, sending debris and dust into the air. Carter's pulse quickened as he surveyed the battlefield. The Jeren had been holding their ground, but it was clear they were reaching their limits. The human soldiers, though experienced, couldn't do it alone, not with the Gorgath's overwhelming numbers, but Carter knew there was still hope. The Vanguard fleet was coming. He had to buy them time. "Captain, we can't hold them much longer." Vega's voice crackled over the comms, panic creeping into her tone. "Their artillery is tearing us apart." "We don't need to hold them forever," Carter replied, his voice steady. "We just need to hold them long enough." He glanced toward the sky. The Vanguard fleet was on its way. He could see the silhouettes of the bombers approaching in the distance, their engines roaring as they closed in. They were humanity's last hope, and they were nearly within range. But Carter's mind was already calculating the risks. If they didn't hold the line for just a little longer, the Gorgath would overrun their position, and the fleet would be forced to retreat or risk being destroyed. "Focus fire on their command center," Carter ordered, motioning to the human soldiers under his command. We hit them there. It's their nerve center. Disrupt their chain of command, and the rest will crumble. The Zherin, although inexperienced, followed his lead without hesitation. They had learned from the best, and now they acted like true warriors. They launched their final counterattack with all the ferocity they could muster, striking at the Gorgath's advancing front with deadly precision. Each ambush, each skirmish, was designed to delay the enemy just a bit longer. The ground rumbled as a massive explosion erupted behind them. The Gorgath had launched their own counteroffensive, but Carter's team had managed to plant explosives on their artillery positions, causing a chain reaction that crippled their heavy weapons. The Zherin had done it. They'd bought them time. "Vanguard, this is Captain Carter," he called into his comms, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We need you now. Take them out." The reply came in an instant. "This is Commander Ilara. We're inbound. Prepare for support." Moments later, the sky erupted with a barrage of missile fire. The Vanguard fleet's bombers came in low, their sleek forms cutting through the smoke-filled skies like deadly hawks. Precision strikes rained down on the Gorgath's forward command center, obliterating key infrastructure. The shockwave sent ripples through the battlefield, and the Gorgath forces faltered as their communications and command networks collapsed. For the first time since the Gorgath arrived on Galtor, the invaders found themselves disoriented. Carter could see their lines breaking, confusion spreading among their ranks. The battlefield was chaotic, but the tide had turned. The Gorgath were on the defensive. "Keep pushing," Carter yelled, rallying his forces. "We've got them on the ropes. Don't let up now." With the Gorgath leadership in disarray, the Zherin pushed forward. Emboldened by the sight of the human fleet raining fire from above, Carter could see the desperation in the Gorgath's eyes as their forces began to retreat, but their pride wouldn't allow them to simply surrender. No, they fought with a last-ditch ferocity, trying to regroup in a desperate attempt to reclaim control of the battlefield. But it was too late. The Vanguard's relentless bombardment continued, and the Gorgath forces broke. One by one, their warships fell, struck down by precise strikes from the fleet. Their ground forces scattered, disoriented, and leaderless. Carter exhaled sharply, his body tense from the adrenaline. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of relief. The battle was far from over. But the worst of it, the Gorgath's unyielding march toward victory, had been stopped. The planet and the Zherin were still in the fight. "Good work, everyone," Carter said into the comms. "But we're not done yet. Get ready. The next wave is coming." The Gorgath had been humbled, but they weren't finished. The real war had just begun. The Gorgath forces were in full retreat, but their defeat was not yet complete. Carter knew they'd regroup, lick their wounds, and come back with a vengeance. However, the battle had given the Zherin something they hadn't had before: hope. For the first time, they saw what they were capable of when they fought back, and that was a victory in itself. "Captain, the Gorgath are pulling back," Vega reported, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It looks like they're regrouping for a counterattack, but they're scattered. Their fleet is in disarray." Carter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had watched the devastation unfold, his mind constantly calculating the next move, knowing full well that the first victory was only the beginning. But seeing the Gorgath retreat, even temporarily, was a milestone he hadn't dared to hope for. "Keep your eyes on the skies, Vega. They're far from finished," Carter said, his gaze turning once again to the horizon where the Gorgath warships still loomed, their engines sputtering as they withdrew. "But this is our chance. We have to press the advantage now, before they recover." In the aftermath of the battle, the Zherin rallied around Carter and his team. They had tasted what it was like to stand tall, to fight with the ferocity of their human allies. Talrin and the other Zherin leaders were already organizing their forces for the next phase of the war. They understood now that survival was not just about defense. It was about relentless offense, about pushing the enemy back, striking when they least expected it. "We've seen what they can do," Talrin said, his voice steady, yet filled with a newfound confidence. "And we've seen what we can do. Tomorrow, we will take the fight to them." "Tomorrow, we take their home," Carter replied. The words felt strange, yet powerful, as if they carried with them the promise of victory. But there was no time for celebration. The war was still raging, and the Gorgath were not going to allow the Jaren or the humans to claim even a small victory without a fight. But Carter wasn't worried. Not anymore. The humans had proven their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, and now so had the Jaren. They had learned from each other, adapted to each other's strengths, and formed an alliance unlike any the Gorgath could have foreseen. The sound of engines roaring overhead signaled the arrival of reinforcements, ships from the Vanguard fleet, their sleek forms descending like thunder from the heavens. Carter glanced upward and saw Commander Ilara's ship leading the charge, her fleet bristling with weaponry. "It's time," Carter said, his eyes fixed on the Vanguard. "Prepare for the final push." The Jaren, now fighting not just for their survival but for the future of their world, took their positions. They had learned the ways of human warfare, guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and relentless strikes. The ground beneath them trembled with the preparations of battle. There was no turning back now. As the final battle loomed, Carter felt a surge of determination. The Gorgath had underestimated them. They had underestimated humanity. And now, the Gorgath would pay for their arrogance. The first rays of dawn broke through the smoky skies, lighting the path ahead. Carter stood tall, side by side with Talrin, looking out over the battlefield that would decide the fate of Galtor. This was the moment. This was where everything changed. The war for Galtor was far from over, but it was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for victory. And with the humans and Jaren united, the Gorgath would soon know they had made a grave mistake by ever setting foot on this planet. "This is our world now," Carter said, his voice resolute. "And we're not letting go." The Jaren raised their weapons, and the humans readied themselves. Together, they prepared for the final strike. The Gorgath had underestimated them before, but now they would learn the price of their arrogance.